Let's bring in Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum. He's a former director of the Congressional Budget Office and also served on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. He joins us now from our Washington bureau. Doug, welcome back to Bottom Line. Always good to have you on.
It's great to be on. Thank you.
Doug, how close are we to a shutdown?
Well, I think that it remains to be seen, to be honest. There are really three big issues. The first is the principle of a shutdown, and both sides apparently agree that it's a bad idea to shut the government. The second is the dollars, and there I think that the divide is not very wide, as Peter Cook mentioned. Then the third that hasn't been raised as much is the notion of policy riders on the stopgap funding. We know there are differences between Republicans and Democrats on policy, and I think that'll be the last piece to fall into place. Now that Paul Ryan has put out his budget in the House, it gives them another arena in which to adjudicate their policy differences. So my hope is they will close down the negotiations on the stopgap funding, get that move forward, and then turn to next year's budget.
Doug, as I mentioned in the intro to you, you're the former director of the CBO. How much would a shutdown cost per day?
Shutdowns are expensive because, number one, you actually have to spend money to shut things off. Number two, you actually have to keep on the payroll, even during a shutdown, those employees who are essential for either preservation of property or emergency response to life. So I don't know the dollar figure in this day and age, but it's not good governance to shut the government. It's not good management to have to pay extra for what you're doing anyway, and it's something we hope both sides can avoid.
What would this do to the economy?
I think the impacts on the economy are by and large overstated. The government workers are typically repaid for the time during the shutdown, so the money eventually goes out in one way or another. There aren't so many government services that are essential to the production process that the rest of the American economy suffers. I think the symbolism is the more important thing, the notion that the government's not being run well enough to keep operating, and the fact there's such big differences about the future path of policy.
But would there be extra penalties, perhaps penalties the government would have to pay if it was late paying contractors?
There's a fairly elaborate shutdown procedure so that if, for example, you've got someone stationed abroad, they've got a lease, the lease runs one more month, you are allowed to keep them on that lease rather than paying a penalty and bringing them back home immediately. So there are a variety of ways to minimize the impact of a shutdown, but regardless of that, it's still bad news.
Doug, let's talk about the budget proposal that was put forth yesterday by the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan. Before we get to your comments, Congressman Ryan was on Bloomberg TV today. We want to play a little bit of that interview and get your reaction.
Whenever you put bold reforms to try and fix budget problems, the other party uses it as a political weapon against you, and that is what has always dissuaded people from actually fixing problems around here. We can't be deterred from all of this hyperventilating rhetoric and all of this demagoguery.
The chairman saying that we can't be deterred. What are the main sticking points here right now?
Well, I think an important way to look at this budget is that it takes on the budget problem squarely. The budget problem is spending. The spending is dominated by the large entitlement spending programs, the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. This budget takes those on directly, and it's quite helpful in that regard. It's also an important step on economic policy. As the President's Fiscal Commission said, this is a national moment of truth where the debt threatens our future prosperity, and this is a promise to eliminate all debt by 2050, a remarkable change in the direction of our fiscal course. And for me, at least, one of the most important things is that it preserves Medicare and Medicaid for the next generations. It's a disservice to allow these programs to continue in their current form. If people don't like the reforms he's proposed, they need to come up with another one.
What we're going through here now with budget negotiations in Washington, and also the overall budget that was put forward, as we were mentioning before the break, by the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan. A lot of talk of spending cuts. That's what a lot of folks in Washington were saying needs to be done. But why not spending cuts and corresponding tax increases?
Well, if you go back to the President's Fiscal Commission, the bipartisan commission led by Erskine Bowles and former Representative Alan Simpson, they really said quite clearly that the problem is big and cannot be dealt with small measures. It's a spending problem, first and foremost. It's all spending, and everything should be on the table. And then lastly, that if you want more revenue, the road to higher revenues is through tax reform. If you look at the Republican budget in the House, it's got entitlement reforms, a desire to deliver the same health benefits at lower cost, other fixes to the programs. It addresses defense savings, about $100 billion. It does other program savings, has a tax reform in it. What you do hear is Democrats saying, gee, we'd like more taxes. We've heard that debate before, but I think it's unmistakable that you're not going to tax your way out of this problem, that to start with these spending reforms is central to solving it.
But that was the criticism on the other side, too, at least from the Democratic side. It wasn't so much about taxing your way out of it. It's balancing the scales and having spending cuts and also having tax hikes at the same time.
Well, the goal, I think, would be to get to a sustainable fiscal policy. It has certainly been the case in the past that when taxes led the debate, we never saw the spending cuts. And going back to my time at the Congressional Budget Office as early as 2003, it was unmistakable that it was a spending problem first and foremost. Once you spend the money, you're going to pay for it one way or another, and that it was absolutely infeasible to tax our way out of it. That's even more true today. We've given up a decade to change some of these programs. We gave up our financial cushion during the crisis. So now they've lost the luxury of easy changes to these spending programs, and it's harder, but the same basic recipe applies. So you have to focus on the spending side.
Doug, as I mentioned again, you were with the CBO, director of the CBO. Where's the political courage and the political will to say now's the time to step up and take a serious look at the entitlements?
I think the fundamental message is that if we don't, we do an enormous disservice to our children. We have the opportunity to leave them what we inherited, the largest, strongest economy on the planet, but we're in danger of defaulting on that obligation and leaving them a broken economy and enormous debt. The second truth is that the important entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, will not last to the next generation, including the poorest and the aged among them. And so it's a disservice to the very constituencies you hear so much about, seniors and the poor, not to reform these programs. They are there to be social safety nets. At the moment, they're going to face big cuts and fail in their tasks. So I think this is central.
Doug, yesterday, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, was speaking at the Council of Institutional Investors in Washington, and he had a take on tax hikes, and he said affluent Americans should consider, shoulder most of the U.S. tax burden, and his quote was, "Those well-off should pay a lion's share. I have no problem with that." I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on that in light of now the discussion seems to be coming around again about possibly rescinding the Bush-era tax cuts.
The affluent do bear the lion's
but I believe he's talking about paying.
Right now.
I believe he's talking about paying even a little more.
He may be, but I think one of the things that any analyst would recognize is that a small minority of Americans pay the income tax. The remainder of Americans are largely paying payroll taxes, and those are taxes into programs, Medicare and Social Security, where they get back more by and large than they pay in. So there's a fundamental imbalance between who's paying and who's receiving that is at the heart of the tax debate. To my eye, the key is that if you want to raise more revenue, how you do it matters. And so a tax reform that lowers marginal tax rates, encourages growth, gets jobs back, and still in the end has the affluent playing the lion's share of the bill is a sensible step for this country.
Doug, in our last 30 seconds, there's been some criticism of Congressman Ryan's plan. And the criticism I heard is, how do you balance the books? How do you make these spending cuts without hurting the least among us?
He is certainly trying to preserve the social safety net. That's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so I think that criticism is misplaced, and those making it need to deliver a plan of their own that preserves them. At the moment, they're on track to simply go bankrupt in a very short time. So this isn't about trying to hurt those constituencies. Better economic growth is going to help those constituencies. The social safety net that lasts to the next generation will help those constituencies. This is a path to that future.
Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, joining us from Washington. Doug, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark.